Good afternoon. Good afternoon, good people. It feels like ages since I've kind of sat in this chair and made a video, but it's probably not that long. But anyway, I am smoking my very nice Parker pot with a bit of Carey's Balkan Special. I have no idea what this smokes like. I'm about to try it. If I can get it lit. Wow. So anyway, this is the first time I've tried this particular blend of tobacco. Just thought I'd give a few different tobaccos a try. Wow. That's quite nice actually. Interesting. I'm not quite sure what I think of that, but it's not unpleasant. Actually, it's quite mild compared to some tobaccos that I've smoked. It's a very kind of slight spicy. It's not sulphurous, but it's almost like a slight sulphur hint there. But it's not as bad as that might sound actually. Anyway, what I was going to talk about was the English and their weather. And people often say that the English are obsessed with weather, and I agree. It's true, and I think there are lots of reasons for that. One of those reasons is that I think talking about the weather means that you can conveniently not talk about other more controversial subjects. So talking about the weather means that you don't ever go near religion and politics, which there's that old saying is that they never talk about religion and politics in company or whatever, because you'll probably precipitate a riot or something. But anyway, so the English, yes, they do talk about the weather. And there are many reasons for that. One is that we have such varied weather, in the UK, from one coast to the other, from the north to the south, and from the east to the west, and that. And where I am on the very southeast coast, even just from where I live to the next sort of town over, in the winter, for instance, we can have very mild weather here, and it'll be snowing in the next town over, and things like that. So the English naturally have this obsession with weather, but I think it's deeper than that. So it got me thinking about this and wondering about why are we obsessed with that? Why do we think about that? Why do we even talk about the weather obsessively? And like all these things, I think once you start, you end up going on a little bit of a journey, and you start to discover things, and you find out things that you didn't know. And I think a lot of the interest or obsession with the weather that the English or the British have is related to the fact that we are an island nation. Now, if you're an island nation, the only way you can get off that island, the only way that you can go anywhere, or at least used to be, was by boat or ship. So being concerned about the weather, was a big deal. Back in the days of the British Empire, when the British were trading with other countries, and the British Navy kind of ruled the seas, if you like, at one time. This sort of expression with the word weather in, you'll hear expressions if you're into sailing and things like that. You'll hear expressions like keeping a weather eye out. So that's to do with keeping watch and being aware, and being mindful of the fact that the weather could change at any time. You'll get expressions like the weather gauge, and the weather gauge comes from the sort of times of naval combat, when sailing ships would engage each other, and if you had the weather gauge, you had the advantage over the enemy, and I think it normally put you in a position to the rear of that enemy, where you were chasing them, and obviously ships in the old days, which had cannon on board, were vulnerable at their rear because they weren't so well protected, and it gave you an advantage if you were engaging in battle or coming upon an enemy ship, if you had the weather gauge with you. So you get this kind of sort of load of expressions that incorporate and focus all around the weather, and it all goes back to the sort of great times in history, when, as I say, English ships, British ships, kind of ruled the waves. Britannia rules the waves, as in the song, and it's to do with that, I think. Hmm. There's a sort of smoky and a spicy texture to this bacco, which is slightly sour, um, but it's actually quite pleasant. So anyway, going back to the weather. So why do the English, obsess and talk about the weather? And I think, when I was looking into this and looking at history, I think that is the main reason. And I was very sort of intrigued to find out about the um, some of the sort of innovations that came about because of the need to understand the weather. And there is a character in history. A lot of people may be aware of Charles Darwin and his voyages on the Beagle, and he went to the Galapagos Islands, and obviously wrote his book The Origin of Species, which was extremely controversial when it came out. Maybe that was 1876. I'm not completely sure on the date, but anyway, it was around that time. But there were two characters that were very significant in those voyages, and the other one that people probably know nothing about or are not particularly aware of is actually Robert Fitzroy, who was the captain of the ship, the Beagle, and he actually, I find, just as interesting, if not more interesting, than Darwin, because he was a man who was a cartographer. Basically, he was a map maker, and he did a lot of the sort of exploration of areas like Tierra del Fuego and all around the sort of Galapagos Islands and other parts of the world. And he charted the coastline, and he produced some of the best maps, which sort of recorded things like the reefs and the depths for sort of ships to use. And his charts were classic works, and were kept at the Admiralty, and people could go and get those charts and then use them for that exploration. And I was just fascinated by this. And then it turns out that not only did he do that, but he was the first man ever to put lightning rods I believe, on the masts of ships. So he was the first guy that ever invented that or did that. And I thought, well, that's amazing. You know, there's a couple of things about that. Not only that, but he then went on to make weather jars. Now you'll have to look that one up because I can't remember the exact ingredients of it, but they were essentially cylindrical glass tubes which had chemicals and crystals in, and what they did was they condensation and moisture and things would form on the insides of those jars, and they could be used as an indicator of storms coming. And this man went out of his way to get these kind of held at every port, I think, in the country. And the reason for that was that if you had those, you could look at them and then it would give you an indicator that there was stormy weather coming. It wasn't any more accurate than that, but it was still a significant thing in itself, because otherwise it was about observing the clouds and literally you were in a storm, you know, and it just hit you. So he went on to do that. Not only that, but he was also the first one to produce weather warnings, which I think were published in the Times back in those days in the 1800s, and they became the first weather forecasts. So who knew, eh? Robert Fitzroy. So I found this man incredibly interesting. I believe there were lots of other things that he invented. You know, he's an amazing character. So people will focus, you know, in history they'll focus on the likes of Darwinism, the origin of species, his theory about evolution and all this kind of thing. But I'm actually more interested in the man that actually got him to the Galapagos Islands and back again so that he could write that book. I actually find his story and the accounts of the things that he did to help other sailors, to help people who were navigating and sailing in those days, which must have been incredibly treacherous. And when you consider that those journeys took so long, you know, people could be away at sea for maybe a year, 2 years at a time without seeing their family. So all of that kind of came out of that sort of looking at that whole thing about, you know, why the English are obsessed with weather. And this is just my take on it, but I think you know, if you look into these things, you find that there are things at the root of them. And that in itself is a bit of an exploration, is a bit of a journey, and you know, I find fascinating because all of these people I would put into that kind of category of being pioneers, and I very much admire the sort of characteristic of those people, and that sort of determination, I think, to, you know, to go to new places and to open up you know, the age of discovery, if you like, and all of that stuff. And I just find it really fascinating. So that's my take on the English obsession with weather. Perhaps we've got other obsessions as well, who knows, pipe smoking. Um, hmm. Yeah, storm jars is what he called those glass cylinders. They were called storm jars, and I can't remember the exact ingredients of chemicals and salts that were inside them, but ingenious, I think, for him to come up with that. Anyway, I am just having a break. It's been a long day, and I didn't get time for smoking my pipe this morning. So, you know, I thought I'd just try one of these different tobaccos, have a bit of a ramble. So this is Carey's Balkan Special. I probably would buy it again, actually. I mean, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting. I'm not quite sure what I think of it. I think sometimes you've got to smoke these things a couple of times, and you know you've got to smell them and come back to them and try them again. I don't know. There's almost like a it's almost like a hint of molasses or something in there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's. I thought that was going to be horrible. I don't know why, but yeah, it's actually quite nice. It might not be a tobacco that I would smoke all day, but it might be one of those. Might be a nice, you know, tobacco to smoke of an evening or something. When you're sitting down reading up about weather and storms, as I do. I'm very sad when it comes to things like that. Mm. Anyway, the English obsession with weather, my take on it is that it comes from the fact that we are an island nation and historically were great sailors and adventurers and explorers, and the need to know and understand the weather was essential to the success of a venture wherever it was. So with that in mind, I'm going to smoke my little Parker pot, which is sort of turning into one of my favourite pipes. I have a feeling I might go for some more of this lovat style, but with a straight stem as opposed to a curved stem. And with that in mind, on this very windy, rainy, sunny summer's day, I'll leave you all in peace, and I'll talk soon, okay? Take care.